Hello and welcome to another edition of Tombo Talks with me, Tombo, here in St. John Studios. Um, Another viewer request was to talk about HIPAA violations in or from state psychiatric institutions. Um, so I suppose I'll break this down into two parts. First, the state psychiatric hospital. Uh, while many of these started off very well intentioned and they had the stated purpose of trying to help either the mentally handicapped, the developmentally disabled, the physically disabled, um, people with Down syndrome, people with various forms of autism, uh, were considered at that time, and the height of this particular epic in American history was between the 1920s and 1950s. Um, Eugenics is the name of the term, and while a lot of people will associate eugenics with Hitler and the Nazis, during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it had a very strong presence in American society. Sort of like if you're looking at incarceration, even today, there's still a very strong, at least in America, a very strong urge to say that, well, just lock up all criminals, throw away the key, done with it. 1920s to the 1950s, that was the prevalent view here in America regarding people who fell outside of what would be considered normal. So, if a student had trouble grasping a math assignment, they would be labeled. Now, today, these terms were considered insulting, politically incorrect, but during the 1920s, idiot, moron, and imbecile were considered medical terms. If you look back at Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts here in the United States, even though children who were housed at Fernald State School and Hospital, probably no longer patients, have been out and free for 50, 60, 70 years, their state paperwork still has idiot, imbecile, and moron on it. So if they're doing anything in terms of checking their social security, if they're checking their retirement, their ability to retire, their qualification for certain state benefits with regard to their retirement, if they've collected a pension and how all that fits together. So all that paperwork still has these. Again, today they'd be politically incorrect, but at that time, those were medical terms. So while there was a well-intentioned perspective in getting these patients into these institutions, into these settings, and cared for, one of the first things to happen was that society was just group all undesirables um, into these institutions. Going back to Fernald in Massachusetts, there were children who were just abandoned there by their parents. They weren't developmentally disabled. They'd passed basic IQ tests. They were still just dumped. Rather than going through and placing them in orphanages or trying to find foster families for them, it was just cheaper and easier for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to just keep them at Fernald. A lot of that was due to lack of funding. I've worked as a contractor at two different jobs for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and that is, you're given a budget, and if it's from May 1st of 2022 to June 31st or June 1st rather of 2023, that's your budget year. So if you've got $500,000 for that calendar year, that $500,000 needs to last. It's got to be there in a fund in the account so that you can draw on it for payroll, for a new keyboard, for staples, staplers, etc. All that, that's the fund. That's where everything comes from. So they were dumping all these people into these institutions, whether they needed the help or whether they needed that place at that institution or not, they were just dumped there because they were considered undesirables. Well, eventually you reach a point where your population, your patient population is high, your budgets are down here. You've got no way to square a circle. So, one of the major problems, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania wasn't immune to it. New Jersey wasn't immune to it. New York became infamous for its inability to fill the hole. Was budget cuts meant fewer staff, fewer services. In some cases, the complete absence of basic care. So the state psychiatric hospital, while it started off as a beautiful thing, while it had a grand mission statement, wasn't really able, over the life of these institutions, to continue to provide that same level of care. HIPAA came around in late 1960s, early 1970s, and the view, because I know a lot of different people around the world, and on Facebook, on Instagram, and if I post this on YouTube, that's going to be completely international. So I can't assume that anybody that's watching this speaks English and understands that, the way that things are here in the United States. So HIPAA is a set of structures, rules, regulations, structured to help patients as far as privacy. Limits the amount of information your doctor can share with the insurance company, with other people, if it comes down to it, with law enforcement or the court system. So it regulates all of that information, and it also it's a platform that allows you easier access, so your doctor can't deny you access to your medical file. Even if they charge you whatever the going rate is for the paper and the ink, they can't say, no, you can't have it. They can say, well, here's the fee, pay the fee, we'll give you the file. So that HIPAA is just an umbrella that it covers all of that here in the United States. I believe the United Kingdom has something similar. Not being British and not being a lawyer, I can't really tell you what the British system is. I've got no experience with the British system. I was made in England and then born in the United States, so I have no personal experience with that. I can't speak to that, with any real personal experience. So the way that the state psychiatric hospital and HIPAA come together in this story is that, and this first came to my attention. I was doing some research, being nerdy, probably 2005, 6, 7, somewhere in there. And there was an online article, I think it was part of a website, a photography website at the time, about Danvers State School in Massachusetts. And what the state of Massachusetts did was, when they started pulling the plug on these institutions, they would empty the wards, they would empty the buildings. A lot of these files, brain samples, blood samples, kidney samples, a lot of that was just left. Forest Haven is another big one. When that was shut down in 1987, the employees didn't bother locking the doors. It was just open. So local teenagers in Maryland would head there, drive down from D.C., head there, whatever, walk around. To this day, I think probably within the last 10, 15 years, there was a lawsuit against the state of Maryland about personal information being left, just littered the floor. State of Maryland spent $88,000 on getting this paperwork collected and destroyed. 3 buildings out of a total of 26 were cleaned out. So that leaves a lot of people in Maryland wondering, well, where did $88,000 of our tax money go when it was supposed to have all of this entire site cleaned out? When I went in 2021 it was. Yeah, it was right. The pandemic was still a thing. So you saw paperwork there in some of the buildings. Again, not all of them. 3 of those buildings were cleaned out pretty thoroughly, but the rest of those buildings had potty training records, psychiatric records, and these were very detailed. A lot of these files had social security numbers. Now it's was it April? We're April now of 2023. So that's one of those things where you think, with identity theft, being as massive a threat as it is, as expensive a crime as it is, and with as difficult as it is a lot of time to do the research and to figure out where does your legitimate information, your legitimate use of your information end, and then the fraudulent information. So where, up to what point are you culpable for whatever fines or loans or credit cards, so it gets to be incredibly expensive, both in money and as well time to combat this. You would think that they would either figure out another way to get people registered in the healthcare system. Again, I know that Great Britain has a different system. Here in the United States, anything about your identity is tied to your social security number. In the United Kingdom, there's a national health registry number, or national registration number or something. I forget the exact term of it. Again, not being British, not having that experience, I couldn't tell you for sure one way or the other. But that would be the British version of the American Social Security number. So whether you're doing anything from applying for a job to applying for loans, university students applying for financial aid, or a simple trip to a doctor, dentist, chiropractor, that's information. The one thing that they ask you for, along with your name, address, phone number, contact information, all that is, in America, is your social security number. Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Nigeria, Jamaica, etc. They've got something different. I believe Canada has another term that they use for it. But again, it's the exact same thing. It all kind of ties into, this is legally, this is how the government, this is how we define you, this is how we are able to find you in checklists or on websites or databases. And going back to that website about Danvers, it was the author of sort of this maybe 2-page, 3-page essay. She had mentioned that it was almost as if these psychiatric patients, first they had this, either it was a genuine mental illness or society just checked them off as other and just wanted to dump them. So they were violated with having to go through the psychiatric institutionalization process. And then once the institutions closed and their records remained without any attempt to, secure them, destroy them, whatever, it was almost as if these patients then were re-violated, and now you've got the personal feminine medical history of a woman and all the things she went through, all the procedures and operations she went through. Well, now that's just easy reading for anybody who just comes in, picks it up, flips it open, and just starts reading. So there was a total absence of privacy. And while in Europe, privacy is taken a lot more seriously. Let's be honest, a lot more seriously than it is here in the United States. Facebook and Google, Amazon will happily go and use your information to sell you stuff. If you know me well enough, you'll know that I'm a heavy, staunch supporter of Apple. Apple does the exact opposite. They will limit, and there's even an option on the newer phones where you can turn off cross-website tracking, so Google can't. Facebook can't. Now Facebook will still spray you with colored vomit in the forms of advertisements. This is how they make their money. But these advertisements won't be as focused on your particular profile. They can't track that information, so of course it's not going to be relevant to you. But it will be relevant to somebody, and they've got to fill that space, so they're just dumping this crap on you, and that's what you see. Uh, I know in Germany and France specifically, they were very anti-Google and anti-Facebook, and both companies had to radically redo the way that they did business in Europe because of those European Union wide privacy mandates. Um, I will never understand why the United States doesn't follow suit with that. Um, I think obviously the German experience in the 20th century was radically different from the American experience in the 20th century. The Gestapo in between 1933 and 1945, and then in East Germany, the Stasi. So having your information openly shared with the government kind of produced an anti. It made it set the stage for Germany, at least, to be very concerned about what people were allowing the government to know about them. And luckily, in terms of individual privacy, luckily, individuals and the government kind of saw eye to eye. And there was a dramatic reduction in what the government, especially the EU-wide government, EU-wide law, would allow Facebook or Google or Amazon to know about you. Now, as the future goes on, as technology gets, as it explodes, just the potential of it, as we're able to cross into new frontiers, obviously there'll be more problems. It'll take us longer to find solutions, but that's with any kind of technology. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming 20, 30, 40 years sort of what these tech companies do in terms of trying to get more information, in terms of trying to sell us, to companies for more ads, for more ad revenue. Be interested to see, one, will the United States take a more European-centered approach to privacy, or will people get tired of it here in America, and will we demand, sort of a stricter leash, a longer, shorter leash, rather, on what it is we're allowing these companies to know about us? Or, like with what Apple's doing, giving you greater access to the controls on how much is shared with Google or Amazon or Facebook or Instagram, etc., etc. It'll be interesting to see how all that unfolds here in the near and long-term future. But in terms of, as I said, I think I know Danvers, I know Forest Haven, and I've personally been to Overbrook Hospital, and they still left reams of admissions paperwork. Again, name, date of birth, home address, social security, all of this. And whenever HIPAA became official, when it was enforceable here in the United States, any file started on that day or after would have been destroyed. The state of New Jersey didn't have money to destroy all of it, so anything that was written before the enforcement date was just left. So as you go in to the basement where the file room was at Essex County's Overbrook Hospital in New Jersey, Cedar Grove, there were these reams of files, admissions, patient files, each of these with very deep, very personal information. Some of them would make it terribly easy to try to commit identity theft. Fortunately, those of us in the community that go after these files aren't doing it for nefarious purposes, but rather for historical preservation. There are those, and I've talked to a handful of them, where that's, if we don't grab them, eventually the wrecking ball will come in. a bulldozer will come in and all of this stuff will end up in a landfill where now it's lost. This is history, whether it's New York history, New Jersey history, this is history that's now being literally thrown into a landfill. Up until now, I've only explored two hospitals, psychiatric hospitals in the United States. That's Embryville in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and Allentown State Hospital in Allentown, Pennsylvania, both on the eastern half of the state. Now, both of those hospitals were demolished by 2021. They were gone, literally just fields of dirt. When I explored them, Allentown had nothing. That was completely cleared out. Embryville had more employee and employer information. They didn't have any paperwork about employees, or patients, rather. None of that was available. I don't know if it was all stolen, if that was all destroyed, if that was just waterlogged and, mold and mildew eaten, because there were some serious holes in the roof. There was a sustained long-term water damage in several of those buildings. So if that's where the files were kept, they were probably just naturally just decayed, destroyed, just by the ravages of time. Or if the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania actually did their due diligence and stored or destroyed them. I have no idea, but visiting both of those hospitals, I wasn't able to find anything. I know that through a series of documentaries about it, I know that Fernald State School, they've got brain samples when patients died. They were, there was obviously an autopsy. Well, there was a dissection of the brain, and they would take kidney samples and brain samples. Rockland did this in New York, too. And they would keep this on file in storage so that they would be able to do research, as our understanding of a human brain progressed with, time, with technology. The hope was that somehow someone somewhere would be able to take these samples and use them to determine, hopefully, were there any precursors, were there abnormalities in brain structure, is there any way to predict this, is there any way to cure this, is there any way to minimize the impact of this. Again, it seems cold and callous in today's society, and you could argue both, but you could kind of tell where the state was looking to keep the information with the hope that it would be, at some time, it would eventually become useful in the future, with the goal of either reducing or eliminating mental illness and eventually, phasing out the state psychiatric hospital. Again, going back to the state psychiatric hospital, they weren't the best of places, but they weren't the worst of places. There were instances where people did get immediate help that they needed it. And of course, not all institutions were bad. There's a book floating around about Pennhurst, which is notorious for abuse and neglect. This book decided to focus on those stories where there was a sense of love and community, where patients were actually treated, humanely, respectfully. So even in the worst of places like Pennhurst, there were those stories of humanity. There were those stories where staff were doing above the cut to try to help these patients because they cared, maybe because they knew that not all patients were getting that same quality of care or the same competence care. So there are stories where acts of kindness and goodness and treatment options were there that actually assisted the ill. And that, of course, you've got to take that alongside of the reports of the abuse and neglect and the sometimes very meticulously detailed account of sort of the files, the photos and the descriptions of injuries and evidence collected. So it's not as though these accusations were just blankly pulled out of the air. So it's while they started off well intentioned, it was those budget cuts and it was just the sheer volume that kind of really. It was sort of like taking a formula and diluting it with water. There was just. There was no way the state was going to be able to find that kind of funding to take care of that many people, to pay for that many physicians, psychiatric doctors, medical doctors, nurses, attendants, etc. There was no way with all those administrators that you were going to be able, you make cuts someplace, in the funding, you're going to have to make cuts on the ground at the institution. And HIPAA in these institutions, at least in New York and New Jersey, if it was written prior to HIPAA's enforcement date, it was just ignored. And these files, reams of them, easily fill dozens of filing cabinets. So it's nice to be able to, for those explorers that enjoy collecting this stuff for the purposes of preserving that history, to have a very personal piece of one of the patients' lives at one of the institutions. So it's nice to have sort of that physical, tangible piece of history that you could, hey, look, this is what happened at. Um, but again, anytime you've got an instance of good like that, there's always that chance where somebody could take advantage of it. Somebody could use it for less than honest ends. And unfortunately, I haven't seen anything on the news about somebody, being caught with a thing of identity theft where they were using psychiatric patient profile information or file information to try to steal credit cards or loans or whatever. So it's goes to show you where the true heart and intention of a lot of the explorers are, is literally, legitimately with that preservation, not with destroying or using this, for the purposes of identity theft. So it's nice to see that the community, at least those that go after saving these files, preserving these files, keeping these files, do that with the legitimate and pure intention of keeping these saved for future generations, or for having that personal piece of Overbrook or Fernald or Danvers or whatever. So it's nice to see. It's nice to see the community come together, especially with as fractured lately with social media, with politics, with as fractured as the urbex community's been getting lately. It seems that the slightest disagreement can cause a massive row or spate between explorers, and because it's such a small community, so those fissures, those splits get very big very quick. Which is, it's a part of society. When you've got large numbers of people together, that's always going to happen. Social media, in a great many ways, exploits that, makes it easier. When you take an organization like Facebook and you launch it internationally, well, that's a greater audience, so that's a larger community. So those fractures and splits can go in multiple different directions. So it's nice to see explorers respect that, either leave it there or collect it with the purposes of collecting it to remember, rather than to do something, lower, nefarious, theft or fraud oriented. So it's nice to see. It's nice to see that that's the goal, that's the intention. It's nice to see explorers not go out of their way to take advantage of that information, or their access to it. It would be nice to see. It would be nice to see that replicated elsewhere in the urbex community. Will we? That remains to be seen. There's myriad different camps, kind of like urbex is almost like high school. Who likes who hates who, why they hate, Um, and just like high school, a lot of that actually gets incredibly, almost mind-numbingly childish. Um, so it's nice to see at least one corner of the community that doesn't kind of degenerate along those same lines, where the key is preservation, the key is remembering history, knowing and remembering history. It's nice to see that commitment, even if it's only in a small corner of the urbex community. It's nice to see that in some small measure that's still something that's an important tenet for at least a small minority of those of us in the community. It's um, again, going back to Overbrook, I've collected some admissions paperwork mainly for the same reason. At the time I went, at the time I had seen the paperwork, it was common knowledge that Overbrook was being demolished and that the land was being cleared for, I think it was townhouses and condos. Um, the hospital's gone, the townhouses and condos are now there. Um, so, I had collected these files, these admissions files, and if I didn't, they'd be in a landfill somewhere, you know, buried under dirty diapers and garbage from restaurants. I would think that my collecting these files and preserving them, again, not too many people have come to St. John Studios. It's about a handful of you that know the layout of this room. A couple of you have even sat in this chair that I'm sitting at now, at the desk that I'm at. So it's not something that a wide range of people get to. I would love eventually to see a museum in New Jersey get these, but the state of New Jersey, with the demolition of Greystone Psychiatric Hospital, the state of New Jersey hasn't convinced me it's ready to discuss preservation. Um, New Jersey, like New York, was one of those states that had a mad rush for deinstitutionalization when it became wide public knowledge that the state psychiatric hospitals were places where abuse and neglect happened almost with impunity. So state governments began this massive deinstitutionalization process. Whether they're ready for, being released or not, we send them out, just dump them. Um, New York did that very publicly, and Geraldo Rivera did a 10-part expose that covered a portion at least of that story. While New Jersey didn't get that same kind of coverage, it was the exact same. The source of that deinstitutionalization was that exact same shock. It's just the deinstitutionalization wasn't as thoroughly and completely covered as the way Geraldo Rivera did it for New York State. Um, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure that New Jersey will ever set up something like that for preservation. I don't even think they do mile markers, like a little plaque. I don't think that they do really anything. Um, New Jersey's state psychiatric system is seen as an embarrassment, and I think a lot of New Jerseyans are of the opinion it's better to forget and move on, which is a terrible shame for those who suffered. That those stories will never be told. Um, it would be nice to see a lot more of that information come to light, a lot more of those stories come to light. Uh, it's not just important to know that the state psychiatric system, those hospitals, those psychiatric centers are no longer here, but it's equally important to know why. The NBC 10 Bill Baldini 5-part special about Pennhurst, Chester County, Pennsylvania, or Geraldo Rivera's, there was a 10-part expose mainly covering Willowbrook on Staten Island, New York City, but they did touch on Kings Park, they did touch on Central Islip, Letchworth, so anything that was near the New York City metropolitan area, so Rockland, of course, Central Islip, I believe Creedmoor was one of them. Of course, Willowbrook's name was in the title of the expose, the original, 20-part 20-minute series, the first episode that he did, um, which again focused mainly on Willowbrook. So it was good to see. It's nice that those videos, at least partially, are available on not Facebook but YouTube. It's equally important to know not just that they're gone, but why they're gone, and how a great idea, mainly through a lack of funding and through society just not caring, a great idea became just a terrible burden. Um, like Geraldo Verda said, the last disgrace, Great Willowbrook, the last disgrace, or the final disgrace. I think it was the last disgrace. That was the name of the expose that he did in the episode that started it, the 20-minute, 25-minute episode that started the series. Um, Again, YouTube doesn't have all of those, but they do have all of the 5-part expose that Bill Baldini did for Philadelphia's NBC 10 about Pennhurst. That is available, and that they are both they're both gut wrenching in the detail. I mean, it's sad to see society's most vulnerable treated, barely even treated. You can't even say that was treatment. Um, it's god awful to see that, but again, eugenics was lock up society's undesirables and just dump them someplace out in the country. If you look back at Cedar Grove, New Jersey's history, Essex County's Overbrook Hospital was on the outskirts of town. It was a very rural area at that time. You go to Cedar Grove, New Jersey, and Essex County, New Jersey today, you'll see that's vastly different. Like anywhere else in the state of New Jersey, Cedar Grove is just growing. Um, New Jersey's got that namesake, that moniker of being one of the fastest growing small states in the United States, and it's still to this day. I mean, I think it's been 20, 30 years of growth, and it just doesn't seem to want to let up in New Jersey. So at that time, once Cedar Grove was looking to, or either New Jersey wanted to host Overbrook in Cedar Grove, or Cedar Grove wanted to host Overbrook. I think it was the New Jersey legislature that just said, well, this is where it's getting built, deal with it. Cedar Grove, you know, they weren't growing up around the institution, so the institution sort of, as the town grew, as the institution grew, they kind of grew up around each other. It's enough to blow your mind if you do research in these places. There are terrible stories, tragic stories at any psychiatric hospital that I've researched. There are also stories of good. Even Pennhurst had their saints and those who stood out above the rest. So it's not impossible to find. Google has literally thousands, millions probably, of websites dedicated to this. YouTube, I'm sure, has equally as many millions of videos talking about Fernald, talking about Danvers, talking about Overbrook, as well as the standard fare Urbex video, the guy with his cell phone, the guy with his GoPro, the guy with the camera just shooting video. So there's absolutely a glut of information about these places. If you're ever interested, it would not be hard to find. Even if you just typed state psychiatric hospital in whatever state, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania have, at least in terms of what I've found doing research, they've got the darker history. Waverly Sanatorium, I believe that was in Kentucky. I believe that has a dark history in it as well. So there's no shortage of information if you're looking. there's no shortage of documentary sites to find this if you're looking for evidence. There's no shortage of any of that. It would all be very easy to find, very available, very, in many cases, very shocking. You know, it's one thing to walk through these places and then do the research. It's another thing entirely to do your research and then walk through them. I like to do my research afterwards. I don't want, for example, when I first two times I explored Embryville State School and Hospital, that was, I didn't do any research, and we'd gone in the afternoon, and the entire, because of the way the hospital was laid out, the entire floor of this one building, all 3 stories, the entire footprint was just dark and gloomy. And it was nice not doing that research because I would have drawn comparisons to its history, to its current state of decay. So I'm kind of glad I didn't do any of that research. And subsequent explores, going earlier in the day or having better sunlight outside, those rooms were still dark, those holes were still dark, but they weren't as dark. So I'm glad I didn't let that information, that research, color my perception on those days that I went without knowing any information. I kind of like going in there without that information. It makes those initial photographs a lot more unbiased. You know, you're not trying to depict, you know, Forest Haven was one of the first psychiatric hospitals I'd ever done research on back in 2004, 2005. So when I had gone there, that's what I was looking for. The abuse, the neglect. That's how I wanted to frame those photos. That's how I wanted to frame those rooms. That's how I wanted to frame those stretchers and beds and cribs. That's how I wanted to walk away. When I walked into Forest Haven, that's what I wanted to get when I was doing my photographs. I was shooting. We didn't really stay long enough to do video. The guy I with kind of got cold feet pretty early on, and he didn't want to hang around. So experience says if one of your group wants to go, just everybody just go. You know, so that was something. And again, Forest Haven was so well known by so many, and it's so heavily talked about within the urbex community for decades that there was no way you were getting around people not knowing what had gone on there, and you kind of almost felt compelled to take those photos to show that neglectful side, you know. And it was sort of like the story, you know, came full circle. While the city of Washington, D.C. couldn't fund these places, these patients were abused and neglected, and then because the people who were left, the employees that were left, didn't care, well, then the buildings became abused and neglected, and now they're just literally just waiting to fall apart. Windows were actually missing. Like there was nothing to stop the ravages of, you know, Forest Haven's 25 miles from the city of Washington, D.C., which is decidedly on the east coast of the United States, so that gets plenty of humid air all year round, you know, and there's heavy precipitation in the area, so it's snow, it's ice, it's rain, it's wind, it's, in many cases, drastic variations in temperatures, which is going to affect the concrete, and the steels to these places are literally just crumbling. You know, so it was because of how well covered the story of Forest Haven was. It was impossible to go in there uninformed and to go in there without any kind of, I don't want to say agenda, but with any real pointed purpose. Like you kind of went in, you had to have the purpose of documenting. You wanted to, at least I wanted to, make that make that connection, you know. I think in terms of doing those individuals who suffered justice, whether it was the constant wage cuts of the attendants, the psychiatric nurses that cared but then just got fed up with the reduction in wages, the increase in hours, and now they're being told, well, you can't even use your PTO, your sick time. Um, Eventually, you just had to, you've got to accept that your best and your brightest are going to feel forced to leave. Um, and again, that's what happened. Forest Haven, Embryville, they left, and they left in droves. Um, so it's a sad subchapter of a sad topic. Here, even in 2023, mental health isn't given the full. It's not even been taken seriously. So Will Smith's wife cheated on him. Facebook turned around and made a meme out of it. This man sitting on national TV live, trying to hold back the tears because his wife just admitted to cheating on him, and Facebook made memes about it. The man's marriage and his life, everything he's devoted to this woman, is all falling apart. Clearly, we're not ready in this country to talk about mental health, which is a shame. But we'll have to see what the future holds.